Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, heartily welcome. It's a great pleasure to welcome you at Diplomatic Academy to our today's not so usual issue, the Indo-Pacific, the world's new center of gravity. It's a great pleasure that also two board members, Dr. Schorig and Dr. Huber from AIES are here, and also Dr. Peter Haider. Great pleasure to welcome all of you. And of course, especially also our speakers. We have 4 speakers. 2 of them will be present here in the room, and 2 will be meeting us virtually. And at the beginning, I just want to welcome heartily Antoine BONDAZ. He comes from the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique de Paris. He has quite a record, I have to say. He made his doctorate of philosophy with summa cum laude, and certainly is one of the most outstanding researchers, as you also can imagine. He's used to be assistant professor in different opportunities, and of course speaker and expert for many questions. Heartily welcome to you. It's a great pleasure that you came here because we are looking forward, of course, because France has to play an important role, not only in Europe, but especially also in the Pacific. I also want to welcome Alfred GERSTL. Probably many of you have been knowing him already. He is not only collaborating with us quite a bit, but he is also the president of the Central European Institute for Asian Studies. And as such, we were cooperating, of course, with him as an assistant professor and professor in different universities and. We also will have the opportunity to meet virtually Stefania BENAGLIA. Hi, heartily welcome. She also is a really outstanding, not only expert, but also an outstanding lady, coming from Italy originally. She also worked for the most prominent think tank in Italy, the Istituto Affari Internazionali, and now she's working for CEPS, the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, and she is a senior expert in a public diplomacy project of EU and. She was chosen among the top 40 experts on India and also the top 100 experts on international affairs. And insofar, we are looking forward to her expertise and also to her words on positioning, not only from Brussels, but also from the position out of Rome. So we also are looking forward maybe to listen to an Italian point of view. Yeah, and last but not least, Christian Wagner will be with us. He comes from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. He also has an academic record, quite an academic record, having taught in Freiburg and in Rostock and at the university in Bonn and of course we are looking forward especially also to hear from his side, especially Southern Asia and beyond that, of course, also a German point of view in the Indo-Pacific. So far, great pleasure for me that you are here because the issue is not very well known, and therefore we also decided not to go into our discussion with the specialists immediately, but to have a short presentation, a few slides, in order to talk what means Indo-Pacific and why is it so important. And I want to start just with a picture with where you can see, you know, they should show the change of the maritime center during history. In antiquity, the center certainly was the Mediterranean. From Egyptians and Greeks and Romans and Venetians and Ottomans and Arabs and so on. But with the beginning of modern times, with the discovery of especially the Northern Atlantic, became the new worldwide center of gravity. With the beginning of the 21st century, this changed once again, and now the Indo-Pacific has become the center. Why? You can see it here. If you look to this circle, I have to, this was not the intention, okay. So, yeah. What does it mean? Indo-Pacific means, I mean, if we try to be what the Indo-Pacific will or should, it is comprehending more or less the whole of the Indian Ocean and the western part of the Pacific, south including Japan, and from Japan southward. Insofar, you could say it's the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific, and this also was the reason for the naming. The naming is pretty new. The first time it came up was, I don't know, 2008 or 2009, for not being conscious. And the reason why this region has become now the new center, the worldwide center of gravity, certainly is the one is the nowadays population, and the other one next to it is the population estimated for 2050. And what you can see is that in this period, Europe will stagnate, America stagnate too, and Southeast Asia, South Asia, West Asia, and Africa will explode. Increase for 600 million people, which means the increase is much, much bigger than the whole population of European Union, or you could say twice the number of the population of America. And in addition to that, you also have further development in Western Asia and of course also at the eastern coast of Africa. But it's not just the number of the population that is decisive, but what is even more important probably is the question of the development of the middle class. And what you can see here, just take the first line, you know, shows 2015, 2020, 2025, and 2030. The middle class in Asia Pacific or in the Indo-Pacific region will almost be 3 times as much in 2030 than in 2050. And this will mean that behind, of course, the middle class, this means that there will be quite some economic development. What do I mean? You can see, you know, if you look at the map, you can see the red painted regions. Those are the BRICS. You have the BRICS within the Pacific area is China, is India, is South Africa. But you also have 8 or 9 out of the next 11 states. It's not just the BRICS that are interesting, but of course the whole number of countries immediately behind them. And this means that the whole economic development, almost the whole economic development, will be in the Indo-Pacific region. This is the blue-colored nations, as you can see, it's South Korea, it's the Philippines, it's Vietnam, it's Indonesia, it's Pakistan, it's Bangladesh, it's Iran, Turkey, Egypt, and insofar you can see or you can imagine what economic power development we will be confronted with. If we just look at global imports and exports from nowadays, and you take only the top 10, then you can see at the moment, just if you look to the bottom over there, the blue one means, you know, that already now the Indo-Pacific area within or among the top 10 is already leading in front of Europe and America. And also the question is with exports around about the same thing. This is the status now. And this, of course, will change quite a bit in the coming years. If you look for energy consumption, you can see, if you look at the blue points at the right side, you know, that North America roundabout has 20% of energy consumption. Europe has 14%. And the Indo-Pacific space already has 44% of energy consumption, which shows very clearly, you know, where there is the industrial drive and the drive of development. So far, this picture maybe also can show you, you know, that almost 80 or more than 80% that of the oil production that goes through the Strait of Hormuz also do go through the Strait of Malacca. This is over here. Already now, 70% of all the oil transports, the maritime oil transports, and go through the Indian Ocean. If we go further on, you know, you can see here the statistics of the 12 most important harbors worldwide. Out of them is just one port, Rotterdam, that is among this list. All the others are situated in the Indo-Pacific. This goes from Shanghai to Kelang in Malaysia as number 12. Nothing. And insofar you can see these enormous dynamics that are behind it. If you look to the recipients of print over here, it's always the top 10. You can see Indo-Pacific is far beyond, far in front of North America or of Europe. But what is even more interesting is, you know, that also the origin states for direct investments out of the top 10 are more in the Indo-Pacific than in North America, or very clearly, you know, not only where the money goes to, but also where it is already and from where it comes for investment. Okay, you also can look, you know, to the top 10 patents in Europe in 2019, and you will see you have the list of companies over here. It starts with Huawei, it's Samsung, it's LG, then comes 3 out of the Indo-Pacific area, then you will find. Also in the technological sector, you already can find more or less a leading or almost leading situation within the region. If we go look further on and take forecasts for the economic development, you can see that only 2 regions, not even the East, Southeast, and South Asia together, will have around about 50% of the world in 2040, not even 2050, already in 2040. And if you compare it, you know, with North America and Europe, you can see 29, whether this is 29 or 31, does not matter, but it shows very clearly, you know, where the dynamics are and will be in the future. If we look further on, also it's quite interesting. That's not only the exports and not only the production, but also if you look at this list, that of strategic resources, then you will find that quite a lot out of them are situated in the Indo-Pacific area. Everybody knows that, I don't know, rare or seldom earth is mostly produced in China. But if you look at the country list, you can see China, Brazil, China, South Africa, Congo, USA, China, Australia, China. So far, you also can see from of market, but also of resources for future technologies that is quite interesting. Yeah, a question, this is only a picture that shall show, that the climate, of course, is moving quite a bit. And the highly interesting thing is not only that you have a very bad air in New Delhi or in Beijing or in other places, that a whole country like Bangladesh is only situated in average 40 of Indonesia now is more or less transferred to a new capital because it will sink into the sea. But what really is interesting, that already now, in the Indo-Pacific area, it only was 37%. So you can say this really is extremely steep increase. And this also shows, that if you want to have a climate change, it will be the Indo-Pacific area where you have to work on, because without the Indo-Pacific area, you cannot change world climate or you cannot influence it. And insofar, this is pretty clear. So I have to speed up a little bit. This is the map of potential great and superpowers. 2 red circles. This is America and China, is clear. European Union, Russia, and India are blue. Only second range. Just let us look. I do not go into details. We will hear about that. This is just Russia's strategy, not very important in the Indo-Pacific area. There's an old friendship with India, but otherwise this certainly will not have the importance. It is quite different, of course, to United States, because the United States always had a counter-rim strategy. This means that they tried to secure the rim at the other side of the continent. This was a consequence of Pearl Harbor, and therefore they tried not only, to establish NATO at the European side, but because they could not do the same thing at the Asian continent, they tried, more or less to organize or control this belt of islands and peninsulas. And this is insofar interesting because, of course, also Taiwan is part of it. And this means there is a vital American security interest in this belt and also in the island. And of course, this clashes immediately with China. Immediately. And this is certainly one of the big questions we will have to treat. On the other hand, China's global strategy, very clear, more or less the whole Asian continent, except Russia, India, and maybe Arab countries. Africa is more or less already in China's hand, and big parts of Latin America too. What does it mean? It means, that, as you can see here, this line here is the Lifeline continent, and what you also can see is, Myanmar corridor. And of course, if you look now to this situation, you can see, just by following Chinese between China and India, but also containment from the east, containment from the west, and even containment from the south. And insofar, this certainly, just by following their own interests, of course, was, to develop their global strategy, the Belt and Road, furthermore. What we can see, of course, is, the high importance of the South China Sea. This is China's claim over here. This China claims not only the two groups of islands, but also the water territories in between. And this, of course, is a question of highest strategic importance. Why? Because if they go to the most southern point, they are right in the center of Southeast Asia, and the one who will control Southeast Asia will control the Indo-Pacific, and the one who will control the Indo-Pacific will control the world. This is the simple way. And insofar, this has highest, utmost strategic importance. If we go further on, you can see there are two geostrategic key areas, less the Middle East region at the other hand. It's also the Indo-Pacific, is the host for most of the nuclear powers. Not only China is a member of, permanent member of the Security Council, but also North Korea, India, Pakistan, and Israel are situated in this region, and you have all the dynamics. You certainly follow also the discussion about Iran and its neighbors. So far, you can see also in this aspect, concentration comes over here. If you look to the military expenditure, then you can see the blue pillars. This is Europe, European Union. The red ones, this is the Chinese development that last year, for the first time, surpassed European Union. But you also can see, it's not only those countries, but also India and Saudi Arabia that are increasing. And insofar, you have also this increase of military expenditure in the Indo-Pacific region. Also, the receiver of arms from foreign countries, it's just the same. I do not want. Of course, this also will bring new constellations, the so-called Quad. I do not explain anymore. We will hear about it. But what certainly is quite interesting, is this map about cybersecurity and the undersea cable internet. And if you look now, at the concentration, this also will mean that he can control of the world, whether this is South Asia or Western Asia, or whether this is Europe, is of course also of strategic importance for us. I do not go into these details. I just want to show you my last slide. It's the same as I showed immediately before. The title is different. The title was Maritime Lifeline for East Asia. Due to this development, we have to be aware that this lifeline is and will be also Europe's lifeline. This lifeline will decide, and our engagement and success will decide, whether Europe can keep its level as economic power, its level as technological power in the future, its place and rank in the world. And insofar, this region will be decisive for our future in a way that almost nobody is aware yet, because we just started a few years ago with this discussion. So thank you very much for your attention. And we will now go into the presentations of our specialists and of our guests. And first of all, I want once again to ask Antoine BONDAZ for his presentation. Please go ahead. Yeah. This goes further, this goes back, and this is the spot.
Perfect. I think you can hear me. Yeah? Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much, Mr. President. That's a great pleasure to be interacting with you today to offer a French perspective on the Indo-Pacific. It might not be a very common notion in Austria, but it's not a common notion in France either, outside of the administration. So outside of the government, even though it has become a catchphrase, in the average French people, of course, the Indo-Pacific was kind of discovered in mid-September last year when we lost the submarine deal with the Australians. And then we started in the press to mention that we lost the mega contract in the Indo-Pacific. And this is basically when most of the French people discovered what the Indo-Pacific is. Very briefly, the French have been the first in Europe to have a strategy dedicated to the Indo-Pacific. It has been actually a very old process because more than 10 years ago, we were already discussing the use of the Indo-Pacific because, as I will explain later, the Indo-Pacific makes sense for the French for our sovereignty interests because of our territories in the region. We used to talk like every other country about the Asia-Pacific, but it would make more sense for the French to talk about the Indo-Pacific. But we decided to use the term officially only in 2018, meaning after Australia, after India, after Japan, after the US. So we've been seen, just following the trend, when actually there were kind of older reflection in the French government about the use of that concept. Very briefly, the French Indo-Pacific strategy is kind of unique among the EU may have in the region. We have more than 1.6 million French people living in French territories in the region, from the Reunion Islands in the Indian Ocean to French Polynesia, from New Caledonia to Mayotte in the Indian Ocean. The French maritime domain, so our exclusive economic zones, are at 92% based in the Indo-Pacific, mostly in the South Pacific, and that's the largest, second largest in the world. And we have 7,000 military personnel permanently deployed in the region. We also have the ability to project forces from France mainland to the Indo-Pacific. Was the case in June last year when we deployed 3 Rafales from French mainland to French Polynesia. And we did it actually a few weeks ago from the mainland, same, but to the Reunion Islands in less than 18 hours. So the idea was to show that we can project even more forces if we fail Caledonia, then French Polynesia, etc. And we have 3 different military commands in the region, based in Reunion Island, New Caledonia, and French Polynesia, plus 2 other regions. We call them Alain-Diassy, in charge of the Pacific Ocean. So the idea is to have the capacity, once again, to be permanently deployed in the region. So the first element of the strategy were presented by the French president in Australia, in Sydney, in May 2018, in a seminal speech. It was actually a speech that was very security-focused, and it made sense, once again, because of this sovereignty interest. The speech itself was on the military base in front of the Ministry of Armed Forces, was the first one to present its own strategy in 2019. And you may remember, because this is when the French Navy deployed the aircraft carrier, Charles de Gaulle, to Singapore for the Shangri-La dialogue. It's only actually later in 2019, 2020, 2021 that we kind of balanced the strategy, adding more on the economic side, adding more on the development aid side, etc. So for a few years, from 2018 to 2021, there was significant and legitimate bias, but the French government had tried hard actually to make sure that to completely rebalance the strategy. And also to be clear, the French have always been very clear on the fact that while the Indo-Pacific strategy, and a lot in the Indo-Pacific strategy, of course, it's about China, partly. Very briefly on that strategy, we used to have 3 key strategic partners. We lost 1 last year because Australia is no longer considered as a strategic partner. The 2 key partners today are India and Japan. We've had a strategic partnership with Japan for almost 3 decades. That's very enduring relations we have with both Tokyo and New Delhi. And the idea is also to have much more actions, concrete initiatives in the region. That's why we have a clear support to a lot of multilateral initiatives to, for example, strengthen the response to natural disasters. This is what we've done, actually, these last few weeks in the Tonga Islands, so using the French forces in New Caledonia in coordination with Australia and New Zealand forces and enable actually the delivery of humanitarian aid and emergency aid to the Tonga Islands. To protect the environment, that's what we call the Kiwa Initiative. That's a specific initiative designed by the Agence Française de Développement, the French development agency, to address climate change and biodiversity in the Pacific Island countries. That's a French initiative, but it has been joined by the EU, by Canada, by Australia, and by New Zealand. So it's a multilateral initiative to fight illegal fishing in what we call the Quad, the same Quad. The Pacific Quad is the US, Australia, New Zealand, and France. So the 4 big countries in the South Pacific. We have also governmental agencies that are much more involved than before. I mentioned the Agence Française de Développement, but also the research institutes, like CNRS, the National Research Center in France, IFREMER in charge of maritime and maritime biology and else, CIRAD in charge of development studies, etc. The idea is to expand the network of researchers and else, of French researchers in the region. A specific focus of the French in the Indo-Pacific, and it has been laid out actually the last few months, is the focus on sustainable development in the region, and the need for the French, but as well as the European, to do even more in terms of development assistance in the region. As it was mentioned before, the Indo-Pacific represents more than 50% of the greenhouse gas emission, and these emissions have risen sharply over the last few decades. 7 out of the 10 top consumers of coal are in the Indo-Pacific, and 15 out of the top 20 rivers responsible for river plastic emission to the oceans are in the Indo-Pacific. As you can see on that graph, the coal consumption in the Asia-Pacific is quite high. And of course, it triggers lots of consequences like air pollution and else, it was mentioned before. But natural disasters are also something very specific to the Indo-Pacific. There is nothing unique in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, there is nothing that is only in the Indo-Pacific. Most of the issues that I may be encountering in Africa, in South America, etc. But specificity that many of the issues are common in many of the countries. So 14 out of the 20 countries most exposed to the direct consequences of climate change, mostly in the Pacific, are in the Indo-Pacific. And you can have the list to the German ranking share of them. 37 of the natural sites worldwide are in the Indo-Pacific, unlike only 24% of the cultural sites. And there are some key biodiversity spots, like the Coral Triangle in Southeast Asia. To face the specificity and the way we deliver partnership, etc., in the region, is the idea that we're going to have a cross-cutting and integrated approach that's going to focus on some transversal issues. So the 3 ideas we have is to focus on climate and social, so climate and development, provide kind of an Indo-Pacific platform in which any country can join. So the idea that the Indo-Pacific must remain a consensual and inclusive region in which any country can basically jump in terms of initiative, provide some funds, provide some experiences, etc. And the idea of the platform we are thinking of, share experiences, etc. That European focus is, of course, very important. You may have heard that last month we've had the very first ministerial forum on the Indo-Pacific, organized under the French presidency of the Council of the EU. It was on February 22nd. It was, of course, a bit overshadowed by the looming crisis and no war in Ukraine, but it was the very first time that foreign affairs ministers from Europe and the Indo-Pacific gathered all together in Europe. The idea was also to initiate some key projects in the Indo-Pacific and to, of course, implement, I would say, the Indo-Pacific strategy for cooperation that we have had adopted at the EU level in September 2021. The key question we still have, nonetheless, is how to focus on the right domain in which we have an added value as Europeans. In terms of very limited, because most of the Europeans don't have capacities to even project forces in the region. So we need to be realistic on what we can do. One of the ideas, for example, is in terms of maritime security, freedom of navigation, etc. How do we make sure that the Europeans are coordinating their presence, Navy presence, in the region. And outside of Northern Europe, etc., the Indian Ocean will be the key ocean. It's very complicated to ask for the Germans, for the Dutch even, to send annually a frigate in the Pacific Ocean. The French do it because we have the bases and because we are present in the region, but it's very difficult to convince the other Europeans to, despite limited capacities, send parts of them in the Indo-Pacific. So we need to be kind of innovative in how we can do. One of the proposals has been for some European offices, Navy, although the capacities are limited, to make sure that when we don't one and the Australian one, when there's the German one and the South Korean one, etc., the idea being it's not only the Europeans, it's the Europeans and their partners in the region. We also need to make sure to have some flagging in the ministerial forum last month. We've initiated a lot of projects that were actually under discussion for years, so they were not dedicated to the Indo-Pacific per se, from green partnership with Southeast Asia, etc. The key question is how can we have kind of a flagship project in the region? So many have been talking about the so-called billion euros, partly European funds, partly member states, and half of it is for Africa. And we still don't have kind of a flagship initiative in the Indo-Pacific. And one of the key questions we should have is what kind of initiative we could have, European initiative for the Indo-Pacific. In my opinion, it must be related to maritime issue, because of course, the Indo-Pacific is first and foremost a maritime region, but we need to be innovative and to have kind of one flagship initiative in the region. The question also we can have is how can we start as well another platform, not for development aid, but maybe for the think tanks, pool resources together, in which we can cooperate much more than before, and in which we make sure that we kind of reach a critical mass. Because so far, Europeans, in the French, even the German, is very difficult to be heard at the EU level for some cooperation projects, some business project. We should have for the researchers, etc. Very briefly, because I've been already too long, 2 points. First, focus on Taiwan, and the second one on South Korea. Of course, I mean, we can discuss it later in the Q&A, but there are a lot of tension in the Taiwan Strait, etc. I think we need to be very realistic on what we can do and what we cannot do. And I think the Taiwanese do not expect us to pretend to be the Japanese, to pretend to be the American, or to pretend to be the Australian. We have very limited capacities. And one of the key capacity we have, or I would say added value we have, is how we can contribute in preventing a country's cooperation with Taiwan. While respecting, once again, the status quo, that is, there is no diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, Taiwan, and there is not even a debate on whether we're going to have some. So the key question is, in the limited space, and the common interest these days are the supply chain resilience and are the fight against foreign interference, including cyber foreign interference. We do have some interest to cooperate and learn, could join what we call the Global Cooperation and Training Framework. It is actually a US-Taiwan initiative from 2015. Japan, it's a technical organization to share best practice technical cooperation. That's something we can do. That's something some EU member states already do, to participate in some workshop, etc. But we could kind of institutionalize the cooperation between the EU and the Taiwanese, the Americans, the Japanese, and the Australians. Very briefly also, the idea of developing what I call a spawn strategy. We will get back to that maybe in the Q&A if you're interested. But with the growing economic coercion of China towards some EU member states, but also towards European companies, related to the tension between Beijing and Vilnius, between China and Lithuania, there is a need to collectively think on how to resist this kind of economic coercion, be it from the US, be it from China, and to make sure that we have a mechanism to kind of attenuate, lower the impact of these sanctions. I know that with what's going on in Ukraine, it's not on the top of the agenda anymore, but we are still discussing at the Commission the anti-coercion instruments. There is still discussion on the kind of compensation funds to help European companies that are being targeted by economic coercion and to Taiwan. Also, very briefly, to promote the stability in the Taiwan Strait, We have limited resources once again, but we can at least strengthen declaratory diplomacy. What we've been doing since 2021, that's very new in the Taiwan Strait. We said it as the EU, we said it between the EU and the US, we said it in the G7 statements, and we even said it in the EU strategy for coordination in the Indo-Pacific. We can also work with the civil society, the think tank and else, and prepare for contingency. And very briefly, because that's a country we don't always mention, we focus a lot on India, we focus a lot on Japan, but South Korea is a very important partner we might have in the Indo-Pacific. South Korea has decided, under the Moon Jae-in administration, to kind of institutionalize a focus on the Indo-Pacific, even though they are not using the concept, under the so-called new Southern policy that focus on Southeast Asia presidential election in South Korea. So the next president will likely change a little bit the strategy, but that's an opportunity, actually, for the Europeans and the Koreans, since there is a new government coming in South Korea, to make sure that we can coordinate to the fullest, to make sure that our common interests, including in terms of development assistance to Southeast Asian countries, can be coordinated. That's something we have initiated between France and South Korea at the local level. So we do have coordination between French and South Korean diplomats in Southeast Asia in terms of development assistance, and that's something that could actually level up at the European level. Now I will end up here because I've been already way too long. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Antoine, thank you very much for your presentation. He is, as you also could take out of his presentation, the director for the Korean and the Taiwanese program within La Fondation. Thank you very much. And we immediately will try to go to our next presenter, and this will be Stefania BENAGLIA. Stefania? Yeah? Or do you prefer
Hello?
that
Yes.
Christian will come first? No.
Do you hear me?
No. You start out. You are an expert for India, as far as I have learned. You lived for a few years in New Delhi. So your knowledge about India is not only from papers, but also from personal experience. And maybe if you start with your presentation. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I understand you can hear me, right? Can
Yes,
you please?
absolutely.
Yes. Okay, great. Because we have been... So first of all, sorry I cannot join you physically today in Vienna. It's quite a pity. But I'm very glad to be here in a virtual presence. Today I will just focus pretty much in two parts. First, a little bit the EU approach in the Indo-Pacific broadly, and then indeed zooming in on the EU-India relations. So starting out from, how the EU intends and sees its role in the Indo-Pacific, because that is actually the new issue that happened in 2021. In a way, we can say that this strategy for the Indo-Pacific was for the EU the first real out-of-area strategy, because it was really a leap forward in the foreign policy for the EU. I actually believe that we're kind of, in the process of the EU and the integration, we're kind of done with the economic integration, or at least we've been moving forward substantially. And now we're finally ready to tackle the foreign policy integration, which is something which of course we will find some resistance. We don't know exactly what the outcome of this mentality change will be, but certainly this mentality change has shifted, has started. And for me, the issuing of the Indo-Pacific strategy was kind of the first real kickoff into this direction, the first milestone. We have seen clearly that recent events in Ukraine pushed the CFSP of the EU much further forward, but that was the first one that was kind of signaling the intention in this mentality shift. We have seen, broadly, again, we can actually, the second point is to see the reinforced defense cooperation with Japan. Japan is a strategic partner, is one of the few strategic partners, just to remind the strategic partners that the EU has in the region, China, India, in order of when they've been signed up, China, India, Japan, and ASEAN. That was the latest addition. So Japan actually, since they signed the strategic partnership, which was quite recent in 2018, actually relations have been going forward quite substantially and quite well. We have seen that they had a number of joint operations, actually 23 joint maritime operations with the EU, so it's quite a substantial number. And Japan has provided assistance to a number of CSDP missions from the EU, from Afghanistan to Iraq. They have also multifaceted joint exercise. So we see that actually the relationship is going forward quite well. And we can also see that in the region, unfortunately, in the Indo-Pacific, hard power is actually the language that is preferred in the region. We can say that it's still preferred worldwide, given recent events, but certainly it is in the region. And we can see this, the AUKUS case clearly tells us that if you're not a credible security provider, you're quite quickly discarded, as Australian unceremoniously dismissed the French contract to prefer the technological cooperation with the US, also for this reason. And we can see now in the context of the war in Ukraine, how India is behaving and the reluctance that India is having, and they will go a little bit deeper this in the second part, but the reluctance that India is having in moving forward to a closer relationship, a closer position to the one of the West, something that, given the trend of the recent, the development of the relations, it was kind of expected. But clearly this reluctance comes from this heavy reliance on the Russian equipment. 60 to 70% of the Indian equipment is of Russian origin. And this has always been there. Actually, observers have seen that there was, if you want, also a clear double standards when it comes to defense cooperation. When India was dealing defense cooperation with Russia, it was going fast, well, and big. And when it was dealing defense cooperation with notably European partners, it was always under heavy scrutiny that the deal was actually undertaken. So this double standard was there, and we are seeing today that is actually, there's a reflection and there's a result of this reluctance of taking a different stand, which is, changing side from your defense provider. India is reluctant to do that. Being capable of having a reliable defense partner that provides you with your equipment for India is more important than moving forward in the growing political relationship that is building with the EU. And again, I will go back with this on later on. But back to, sorry, of course I got back on India because it's indeed my core expertise. But back to the cooperation with Japan, that if you want, is actually very promising in this context. There's actually, given that it's relatively recent, again, just a couple of years, it has been moving forward quite well, even on the security and on the maritime security cooperation. There have been fast improvement. We see now that in the mind of the Europeans, there's this expansion of the coordinated maritime presence, which certainly offers an opportunity for enhanced defense cooperation with Japan, an important one in the region. And we have also projects and important initiatives such as PESCO. Of course, PESCO for now is more of a label, is more of a symbolic project. It won't be actually a project that has an impact. But would the EU invite Japan to be one of the, actually for now we only have 3 countries non-EU that are part or have been invited to participate to PESCO projects. But would that be something that happens? So would the EU invite Japan to participate in a PESCO project? well, that certainly would be an important signal to send for the partnership and the intentions of the EU in the region. So, and actually, this is again just this would help a lot the perception of the EU as a defense security provider. Now, the definition of EU as a security provider is, of course, a definition which is very abstract, because we are nowhere close to having an entity such as a EU security provider, which is there. But I strongly believe that at the end of this lengthy process, we will have one. So we're just starting right now. So this enhancing the credibility of the EU in the Indo-Pacific, also as a security provider, is vital for the EU, credibility of the EU as a global actor. So within this global bigger picture, this fact is actually going to have a heavy weight. Of course, talking about Indo-Pacific and the role of the EU, we cannot dismiss, of course, the fact that there is the recent invasion of Ukraine has brought up even more the fear in Taipei of a potential Chinese intervention in Taiwan. And of course, we are seeing that the China-Russia cooperation is increasing in these days. And of course, this is quite something to watch very closely to see how the situation will evolve. How the EU will be, again, how the EU can act in this context is all up for discussion. But what is not up for discussion is that the EU will have to act in this context and will have to be an actor that influences the situation. Of course, it will likely not be a traditional security provider a la US, if you want to say. It will be a different entity. It will be more likely having a richer and a more connected security definition, leveraging on the economy rather than really relying on heavy hard power. But we need to to enter this adult discussion about which kind of EU CSDP, in this case, actor we want to have. And the EU, above everything, really needs to learn how to speak the hard power language, which, again, we have seen that this is the language that is spoken everywhere in the world, and certainly it is in the Indo-Pacific. So now, zooming in a little bit on EU-India relations. Very quickly, we had period 2012 to 2016, where the relations were non-existent at all. But between 2016 to today, we actually had a very good improvement of relations between EU and India. And this is very, that culminated in the last summit in Porto, when we had the connectivity partnership that was signed. And that was, and in the relaunch of the FTA negotiation, of course. So we have seen actually there was a lot of political capital, especially from the EU, but not only. The EU was in a way driving the force for some time, but certainly India was very much in the game as well. There was a heavy political investment. And if you want, that raised some expectation. So we were kind of like, you know, that this is a partnership based on shared values, based on democracy, based on certain issues that we both understand in the same way. And actually then, we have seen that with India, that recently, again, going on the Russian invasion to Ukraine, there have been 5 votes at the UN to which India abstained, which was, if you want, not very surprising for observers, because India also in the previous Ukraine crisis had a much more lenient position towards Russia. So, you know, for observer, that wasn't necessarily a surprise. But if you want, that was a little bit against the expectation, because again, we had a few years where the political capital was there. There was an increasingly level of expectations that was built, and perhaps there was a level of expectation that the India would actually choose the Western camp, if I want to simplify it this way. And as a matter of fact, we have seen that again, the language of hard power, the fact that he is so heavily reliant on the Russian equipment actually led India to take the decision of not taking this side and taking a more neutral and abstaining position. It's very early to say how far this position will go, but just today I was reading an article of an interview of a senior official saying how they are actually ready, because of course with the introduction of the sanction and the SWIFT, it is difficult now to pay the equipment from Russia, from the Indians. So they're looking at ways to buy the equipment and selling agricultural products as kind of like exchange. So this actually can lead to think, well, that doesn't really seem to be a position very much lenient towards the West. But again, there's a reasoning behind, and this is the point I want to make is simply that there's still an investment to be made when it comes to EU-India relations. And we are not, the fact that the EU lacks this credibility as a security provider weights in this context as well very much. Just one point on more in the EU-India relations on the importance of connectivity. Connectivity is, as I said, one of the major deliverables of the last summit. And we are seeing, of course, today with all the discussion about the energy prices and how, of course, energy provision, oil provision and gas provision can be used as leverage. Of course, we can understand how critically important it is to have efficient energy connectivity, which is again one of the pillars of the connectivity partnership. Just for remember, the connectivity partnership, the connectivity is defined in 4 ways for the EU: people to people, so all the research environment, energy, transport, which is the more traditional roads and bridges, etc., and digital, which again is very hard to miss the importance of it given the context. So before concluding, I just want to briefly mention the fact that Indo-Pacific is slowly but truly entering the foreign policy of countries which are not Germany and France and the Netherlands, which already had their strategy, and if you want, they also had a position in the Indo-Pacific. Very recently, last week, I think, Italy issued a paper which is detailing the cooperation that Italy is doing to implement the Indo-Pacific strategy. It's not exactly a strategy in the sense that if you expect something where, you know, it was a little bit the criticism that was moved for the EU strategy for the Indo-Pacific. This is not really telling where they want to go, but is rather telling what they are doing. So Italy issued such a document as well, which is actually worth mentioning per se, because again, this may not be in the mentality of all the member states. It may not be an immediate reflex to have a strategy or even a document that says what you're doing in the region. So per se is actually quite a noteworthy issue. And another one is, for example, the fact that the Czech Republic, that will hold the next presidency after France, has as well Indo-Pacific as a priority, and even has an ambassador for the Indo-Pacific, which actually, to my knowledge, very few countries, I dare say only France has an ambassador for the Indo-Pacific. So again, we are seeing that the shift may have started from some driving member states. It went to the EU, and then actually now there is the joining up forces of all the member states that are following the lead of the EU. So in conclusion, I just want to say that the EU is indeed ongoing a mentality change in its foreign policy, and the Indo-Pacific really is central for this, because this is where where it all started, and where it knows there will be repercussion in the middle at least. India certainly was the prime focus and the most promising partnership. the fact that the current choice of abstaining from the UN votes might have brought a little bit of a shadow to this positive mood and this positive trend, but it is way too early to say if this will actually have an impact on the relation or not, and if it will simply remain an episode. So I stop here now because I expect to have some Q&A later, and again, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Stefania, thank you so much. Molto grazie for your presentation. And I only can speak out how important it is to get more information about the European relationship, especially with South Asia. Why? Due to the Brexit, there of course is a big lag, because in the past, usually Great Britain cared about India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, and nobody else in European Union really concentrated on it. And with the Brexit, of course, there came a new situation, and therefore we are talking today not so much about Japan or China, but rather in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and their relationships. And therefore I just ask Christian Wagner, our next speaker, to continue and to give us his presentation on South Asia and beyond.
Well, good evening, everybody. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
Am I audible? Yes. Thank you. So good evening, everyone. First, it's also a great pity that I'm not able to make it to Vienna in person tonight. I want to thank the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy for the kind invitation to this event. I will focus mainly on the German approach to the Indo-Pacific, but I think we can also discuss some of the points relating to South Asia later towards India, or probably also as important relations towards the other countries that were mentioned as the next 11, like Pakistan or Bangladesh. In order to focus on Germany and on Germany Indo-Pacific guidelines, I will focus just on 4 points. First is, what are the strategies about? What is their objectives? What are the means and the instruments, and what are Germany's preferred partners? What has Germany done so far, and what are the prospects? The first point, what are the guidelines all about? First, it's important to mention, as in the case of EU, as Stefania has already done, the Germans have not published a strategy. They have published guidelines, because when you have a strategy, you should have some idea of a priority. Whereas when you read the guidelines, it's more an overview, a collection of what Germany is already doing in the Indo-Pacific area. Germany also has a very broad understanding of the Indo-Pacific, as mentioned in the beginning, stretching from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of the Americas. It's also an inclusive concept, so it's not aimed against China. But I think this is also part of the EU strategy, and Antoine has made it similar in the French perspective. The guiding principle of the document is to underline Germany's aspiration to contribute to a rules-based order in the region. We have heard in the beginning on the importance of this region for Europe's future development, and I think Germany, as the EU, has a strong interest to establish a rules-based order in order also to secure welfare for this part of the world and for Europe in the long-term perspective. But there's also some interesting and some new aspects in the guidelines on when you read them a little bit closer. First is probably the recognition of geopolitics and geoeconomics in German foreign policy. This is not very remarkable for on Antoine and a country like France, which has always been an Indo-Pacific power. But I think it's quite a remarkable change for Germany, because relations with Asia were so far mostly looked through the lens of our economic relations, but less so under a strategic perspective. So Germany has also been a strong supporter of the concept of the Indo-Pacific, which represented the era of globalization that started in the late 1980s. So the shift is also remarkable because some of you may remember that in 2010, a German president, Horst Köhler, had to step down because he was being criticized in Germany after he has made remarks about Germany's interests in other parts of the world and potential military engagements in the future. So the new geopolitical and geo-economic perspective also forms the basis of Germany's of the formulation of Germany's interest, which is also new because German foreign policy makers have been for a long time very reluctant to spell out their national interests. As you know, the Germans have always been very, very happy to have their security handled by NATO or the US, their economic development by the EU, and their energy security by Russia. But these things are going to change, and I think the guidelines in some parts are also part of this change. So we have now geopolitical interests in the region, which are peace and security, also that we do not want to see, and I think that we are have a great commonality with our European friends, neither a unipolar or a bipolar structure in the geo-economic field. We want to have the open shipping routes and digital transformation and connectivity among other areas. So Germany will also, and I think there we have a relatively similar program in which areas we want to engage in. I think it's important to keep in mind that an important aspect, when I said Germany has an inclusive definition of the Indo-Pacific, it also includes that we are continuing our relations with China. But the main aim is to diversify our relations with the countries of the Asia Pacific. We have seen a long debate in Germany, and that Germany is focusing too much on China. So part of the guidelines is also to diversify the relations to main partners. There are some of them are mentioned in the document. It's South Korea, it's Japan, it's Australia, it's also in India, but also smaller countries like Singapore. And the main areas are climate change, the strengthening of a rule-based order, trade and connectivity, but also supporting democracy and human rights. Second point, or the second part, is what kind of instruments, what kind of partners do we have? As I mentioned already, we are going to expand our bilateral relation. Germany has the problem that we have always been a very strong economic partner in the region, but we are lacking political visibility. It's not like France. Antoine has made the point, when you are power in the region, you have a much bigger and the easier presence compared, for instance, to Germany. So, of course, many of the activities, I think, will also be necessary to, let's say, increase visibility. What is also obvious in the guidelines is that we have a strong focus on regional organizations. Germany, as you may know, is the most important contributor within the EU for the development of ASEAN, and Germany has always had a strong interest in strengthening multilateral institutions. We have started the Alliance for Multilateralism. We will also join the French and Indian the International Solar Alliance. But Germany has always been a strong supporter of the ASEM, the Asia-Europe Summit meeting. So I think this will be the main avenue or the main instruments by which we will try to increase our cooperation with the region. As I mentioned, the partners, Singapore, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, plus the regional organizations, I think this is a quite the standard setting, let's say, for German foreign policy. The guidelines have been published in autumn 2020, and I think we have seen a lot of progress in the last 1.5 years. And this brings me to my third point. What kind of progress have we achieved so far? Under the German EU presidency, we have relations with ASEAN have been upgraded into a strategic partnership. We have also seen that together with France and the Netherlands, we have been instrumental in passing the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. Germany has also participated for the first time on a ministerial level at the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting. And of course, Germany has increased its support for ASEAN, for instance, capacity building on the interpretation of UNCLOS, the law of the seas. What have we achieved on the bilateral level? I think this is also an interesting development because, for instance, with Japan, we have set up 2+2 meetings between the foreign and defense ministers, which was the first kind of this format in the Indo-Pacific. With Australia, we have established an enhanced strategic partnership. So we're trying to have some new instruments in order to make our presence more felt in the region. Probably the most innovative approach was in the field of security. Some of you may have followed that the German frigate Bayern was on a training mission in the second half of last year. It just returned a couple of weeks ago back to Germany. So it was on a training mission in the Indo-Pacific. So this was the first German naval presence in the region in 19 years. We had a visit of 16 countries. Of course, it's not to compare this kind of presence with the kind of presence that France has, and Germany, of course, faces capacity problems. So it will be difficult to increase naval presence in the region or to step it up. There is some discussion going on that from 2023 onwards, we may deploy 2 ships on a permanent basis in the region, and we may have a potential hub in Singapore or in Japan. Of course, an important aspect of the German government is climate change, and of course, Germany as a main trading nation in Europe is a strong proponent of free trade negotiation on EU-India negotiations, which we may see how the progress will be, but also, let's say, to implement the EU's connectivity strategy. Let me come to the final point, so we have some more time for the Q&A. I think Germany faces some problems. The biggest one is probably simply to increase the visibility. We are always there in the region. I always face the problem when you are on conferences in the Pacific, you are always criticized that Germany is not there. But the moment I put out some trade figures on the table, well, the discussion changes. But I think it's obvious that we somehow face the problem that we are an economic giant, yes. But of course, on the security side, we lag, and as Stefania has mentioned, in many of the think tank discussions, these hard security aspects play a much bigger role. Second point where I'm a little bit critical is the strong focus that Germany places on regional cooperation, for the simple reason that we have a great emphasis, and I think we can all agree that ASEAN is the most successful example for regional cooperation next to the EU. But when you look at other regional organizations in the Indo-Pacific, they are not very strong. So we have not seen a lot of progress when you think about organizations like the Indian Ocean Rim Association or BIMSTEC or SAIC or the ECO. So you wonder in how far this very traditional focus is probably the best instrument to deal with the future challenges. What is a little bit more difficult for Germany so far is to enter the area of minilateral cooperation. We have seen in the last couple of months and years that we see new minilateral groupings like Quad between India, Australia, Japan, and the US, or we have seen an Australia, Japan, India triangle, and we've seen some other formats. So I think this is probably these different concerts of middle powers. This may be the better instrument to cope with some of the challenges in the future. And here Germany may find it difficult to enter or to find access to these kind of minilateral groupings. So I think this will probably be the biggest challenge for Germany in the mid to long term. But I'm very optimistic that, of course, with the economic power that we are representing, that we are an attractive partner for many countries in the region. So with this, I would like to conclude and thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian Wagner. I should say Dr. Habil, Christian Wagner. I usually do not mention the exact title, but he is an outstanding academic too. And thank you very much for your presentation. And last but not least is Professor Alfred GERSTL, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Werner. As I do have a couple of slides and also a lot of text, I think it's easier for the audience if I stand here. And I hope also, everyone can see me and hear me. Thank you very much, Werner, for pointing out the strategic location of Southeast Asia, which is the topic of my presentation in the Indo-Pacific. Well, it is the geographic center of the Indo-Pacific, or as you can call it, it's the geographical heart and the political center of this enlarged region. We already heard about the importance of the South China Sea as a sea line of communication, but in particular, Southeast Asia, South China Sea interlinks the Indian Ocean with the Pacific Ocean. So there we have the strategic importance. Politically, we do have, as already mentioned by Christian, we have the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is the only regional organization that was able to establish trans-regional political, security, and economic structures. So there is a kind of multilateral rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific established and led by ASEAN. Also, if you look at China's Belt and Road Initiative, you also see the huge importance of Southeast Asia because, well, partly the land-based Silk Road goes through Southeast Asia, but even more important is the maritime Silk Road. Especially, well, the unfortunate war in the Ukraine. I do believe that at least for a couple of years, the importance of the land-based Silk Road, so the connection Russia to Ukraine, to Europe, will decrease in its importance, whereas conversely, the importance of maritime trade, maritime Silk Road, will increase in the next couple of years. Apart from the sea lines of communication, about 1/3 of the global trade is conducted through the South China Sea, and the share for Japan, Australia is much, much higher, of course. We also have oil, gas, mineral, fish, other resources in the South China Sea, so it's strategically, also geoeconomically, an important area. Just briefly, because we would need hours, as some of my students know, to speak about the reasons for the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. So here I want just to emphasize that China, but also Taiwan, claim about 90% of the territory of the South China Sea, and both argue with so-called historic rights. As we know, Officially since 2016, because the arbitral tribunal of the Permanent Court of Arbitration made a judgment, an award, and ruled against the so-called historic rights because they are not part of UNCLOS, not of international law. So you cannot argue with historic rights under this United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. In other words, legally, the 9-dash line of China and Taiwan is legally void. In addition, also China has built artificial islands, militarizes them. Vietnam does the same, but it's only 2 islands. China also hinders the other littoral states, so mainly Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia, to conduct oil, gas, resource exploration activities, fishing activities in their own exclusive economic zone. Conversely, China conducts these activities in the exclusive economic zone of these territories. We heard a lot from Stefania about, she used the term hard power language, and the United States use this language. So they conduct so-called freedom of navigation operations. France also was part of one. Sometimes it's not leveled FONAP, but in fact also Japan conducted some. So this operation should show the force of the United States and its allies, of course, messages directed towards China. ASEAN is no dispute party. It's a kind of mediator, but it has no clear position because for some countries of ASEAN, so it's a 10-member organization, South China Sea is not that relevant. ASEAN, that may surprise some, but not all, especially if you're familiar with the region, ASEAN has so far failed to criticize China for not accepting the award of 2016. So China is never named and shamed. So therefore, it might be a disappointment, but it's not a surprise that ASEAN did also not condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So it's the typical wording, very, very careful of ASEAN that we have seen in the last 20 years in relation to China's behavior in the South China Sea. So also this year, it's already 20 years that ASEAN has started or wanted to start with China to negotiate a so-called regional code of conduct in the South China Sea, but so far there are no results. So this demonstrates that, well, there are institutional mechanisms in place in Southeast Asia, in the Asia-Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific region. There are certain limits to ASEAN's influence. Nevertheless, we speak, and also the other governments in their Indo-Pacific strategies speak and endorse ASEAN's so-called regional centrality in the Indo-Pacific. What can we understand under this term? Well, after the end of the Cold War, ASEAN was highly successful in expanding its influence, its norms, values through institutions to Northeast Asia, South Asia, Oceania. So we can also say ASEAN has kind of ASEANized first the Asia-Pacific and now the Indo-Pacific. Couple of acronyms, you can have a closer look later on. So the key security organization is the ASEAN Regional Forum. If you look at the membership, it's by far the largest security forum in the world. No wonder China's member, the EU is member, Russia's member, United States, among others, member. Also, cooperation mechanism with China, with South Korea, Japan, that's ASEAN +3. The East Asia Summit, that's a very interesting mechanism because here the head of states of China, US, Russia, Australia, India, New Zealand, South Korea, I hope I have not forgotten anyone, come together and discuss once a year current or pressing topics. In addition, there are bilateral cooperation formats with the key dialogue partners of ASEAN, including the European Union. ASEAN has also a so-called Indo-Pacific Outlook, and there, again, it stresses its self-proclaimed leading role, but again, emphasized by all other governments, because in fact, this is the default position in the Indo-Pacific. It's the only transcontinental structures, so everyone is happy that there's at least a kind of multilateralism, a kind of order, and some dialogue formats in place. Nevertheless, and that's important to highlight, unlike the European Union, ASEAN has no common foreign and security policy. Similar to the EU, it has no ASEAN army. So it is a very weak actor, however, and this sounds like George Orwell. Weakness is strength, because ASEAN is not a threat to anyone, so it's regarded as a kind of honest broker by the other actors. So that's ASEAN's successful method so far. It's an inclusive form of regionalism, so all stakeholders should be brought to the region. They should have interest there, and the more actors are, the easier it is for ASEAN to balance them, so not through its own strengths, but to try to find compromises between them, especially, of course, between the United States and China. And one example is connectivity. Here again, ASEAN aims to be the bridge or coordinate between the different competing connectivity initiatives, like the Global Gateway Initiative, like the Belt and Road Initiative, or G7, Japan, US, Australia, Taiwan even have kind of infrastructure initiatives. So important for ASEAN is to try to be on equidistance, so to be not too close to the US or China, to be really regarded as the honest broker. However, ASEAN's position is, of course, very precarious. Again, no common foreign security policy, no strong actor, and this means both the United States and China will only accept ASEAN's leading, mediating role as long as it's in their interest. And this can only be as long as there is a balance of power between the US and China. If one of these two nations become too dominant, why do you need ASEAN? So that's the danger here, not only for ASEAN, but for the whole order that we do have in the Indo-Pacific. Another problem, of course, is ASEAN's way of conducting diplomacy. It's not preventive diplomacy. There's a strong focus on sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference, and the way of the diplomacy is you talk until you have a consensus. And if one of the 20, 30 members of the ASEAN Regional Forum says no, then you won't be able to make a decision. Therefore, the legitimate criticism, ASEAN is a talk shop, it's a paper tiger, and they are not yet at the stage of preventive diplomacy. That's the criticism I always utter on ASEAN. However, if you look at the current situation in Europe, we have so many institutions in which Russia is also participating. But nevertheless, Russia started an invasion of Ukraine. So in other words, if a great power wants to break the law in Europe, no way to hinder it, unfortunately, and the same will happen in the Indo-Pacific, and there, of course, very likely either the US or China. Hedging also, of course, very interesting but complicated strategy. Here just to sum up the basic idea between hedging, and that's the most popular strategy among the ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries, also ASEAN, is you want to reap benefits, economic security from all powers, especially China and the United States, but on the other side, you must be careful to not become dependent on them, or China is regarded as threatening. That means you cooperate closely with the US against China, so that is meant with confrontative measures. So it's a very opportunistic strategy, of course. But important is never become too close to one of the major powers, and that is one of the key slogans of the diplomats, politicians in Southeast Asia, directed to China and to the US. Do not force us to take side with one of the great powers, because then they lose their strategic autonomy. There's a lot of distrust towards China in Southeast Asia. It's, of course, the military upgrade. There are fears of becoming economic dependent, not least through the means of the Belt and Road Initiative. Vietnam would be such an example. On the other side, also, I like the quote of former Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, who made clear the political system, the authoritarian system of China is not attractive for the Southeast Asians. But on the other side, we also have to be realistic. There's no love affair with the United States. There is also distrust, especially going back to the era of Donald Trump, his unilateralism. He never met with ASEAN as a forum. He didn't attend the East Asia Summit, which is really was a blow in the face of ASEAN. And yeah, of course, they're also aware if there's a confrontation between the United States and China, there is the risk for the Southeast Asians to be drawn in this conflict. And again, they would have to choose sides. That's why, in general, all Southeast Asian nations, they pursue omnidirectional, very diversified relations with China, with the US, and as the preferred third partner, Japan. And then you have a long list of other nations. When it comes to economic cooperation, the EU is, together with the US, among the top investors, not the key trade partner, but it's also strong. And then you have South Korea, Australia, India, Russian, not so much trade, but in regard to arms deals and also other security cooperation. It has been mentioned, Southeast Asia is a vital part economically of the Indo-Pacific. It is many of the products we use. If you have a Samsung phone, for instance, it's very likely that it has been produced in Vietnam, but the parts, of course, come from China, Thailand, Taiwan, all other countries. The growing consumer market has been mentioned by Werner, so there's also a strong economic importance. Just to show you also in regard to free trade areas, very interesting project is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It is in fact an ASEAN brainchild, but it is now associated with China's initiative. But really, it was first started by ASEAN. Here, all ASEAN members are part of it. Also China, Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand. You see, India is missing. The idea was to integrate China in the broader regional structures, but at the same time invite counterweights to China. So with Japan, Australia, you have strong economic actors, but it was bad luck for ASEAN that India dropped out due to domestic concerns. More concerning for ASEAN's unity was former President Obama's Trans-Pacific Partnership. Donald Trump canceled it at the second day in office, which I think was not a smart idea. The idea, of course, was a kind of containment of China economically. And for ASEAN, concerning is that not all ASEAN members are members of this now called Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. By the way, China, United Kingdom, just a few months ago applied for membership. So it will be really interesting to see whether or not China in particular will be admitted to this trade and economic cooperation mechanism. Just briefly, opinion surveys, they're very interesting. They don't tell the full pictures, but sometimes they are actually give you glimpses of insights. Just released a few weeks ago by the colleagues of a Singaporean Research Institute. And here it's really fascinating. In the year 2021, the EU was regarded as the main provider of leadership for maintaining the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific, and this has completely changed in the last year. So the United States is now ranked first, and one of my interpretation is, in fact, indeed, if there's a crisis, you need hard power to actually maintain this order, and the EU is exactly lacking this capacity. To conclude, I would like to present two scenarios, and they're drawing on Putin's war, so the invasion of Ukraine. Scenario one, what could happen? a strengthening of the existing multilateral order in the Indo-Pacific. This would mean that ASEAN's position would be further strengthened. ASEAN would provide even more trans-regional leadership. It would also include a turn to preventive diplomacy. This also would mean likely majority voting in the RRF. So that would be a possibility to sanction a country if it violates international law or regional decisions. How likely is it? Not very, to be honest. Scenario 2. Distrust in international law will further increase. This means the existing multilateral structures will be further weakened. We'll face a revival of great power politics, which means intensification of the Sino-US rivalry. This also would imply a decline of ASEAN's influence. Then there's no need for a mediator. It's really between Washington and Beijing. What would be the reaction of the Indo-Pacific nations? They will turn to the self-help principle, so strengthening their economic base, but in particular, their military capacities. So more spending on weapons, but also selective cooperation in security matters, and here in particular with the United States. So this would also imply a further deepening of AUKUS, of the Quadrilateral Alliance, and this alliance mechanism would cooperate also with other nations in form of ad hoc coalitions of the willing. And for instance, Vietnam was already pretty clear that it aims to deepen the cooperation with the Quad, but in which form, that's open to see. This development, of course, is a strong challenge to ASEAN's regional centrality, but also its unity, because different members have different alliance options. Some may really turn more to Beijing. Others, of course, will deepen their relations with Washington. Just to briefly mention, what would this mean, this strengthening of the self-help principle of nationalism for the promotion of human rights and democracy? Some of you have already read or have now heard about the Indo-Pacific strategies, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategies, and the Western nations put a strong emphasis of human rights and democracy. However, if it goes to the hard power language, I do fear that human rights democracy comes second. Also, if you really want to contain China, you, for instance, need Vietnam as a partner, and Vietnam is unfortunately not famous for its human rights record. So there's a lot of rhetoric or lip service. What would such a turn away from multilateralism, from international law mean for economic cooperation? I think there are also different scenarios. One that has been discussed very recently is kind of new economic blocks, also in the Indo-Pacific, so US Western bloc versus a China-led bloc. I don't know where ASEAN fit in this scenario, but happy to discuss it. So how likely do I regard this scenario? Unfortunately, very likely, because I do fear that everyone in the Indo-Pacific will draw lessons from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And maybe there's a third scenario, a fourth, that I have not on my slides. So also happy to discuss it. However, right now, I fear that I have to conclude with a quite bleak and pessimistic outlook for the future of the Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. And I only can say, I hope you are not too tired yet, because this was certainly a mass of information you got now. But now you have the chance for around about 15 minutes to ask a few questions, and you will get answers. Who is the first one who wants to ask a question? Yes, please.
Do I open the... Okay.
Yeah, maybe.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes.
maybe you take off the mask is better for understanding.
Sorry. Thank you very much. that was an interesting point about ASEAN. And I know my question is speculative, but why not? Uh, okay, so let's suppose scenario 2 becomes real. And it was mentioned earlier that at the moment, European Union does not really have an Indo-Pacific strategy yet. But supposing it becomes real, then what kind of an ideal engagement or interaction between the European Union and ASEAN would look like, and why? That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. May I ask whether there are other questions? Yes, please.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me? Yes. I would just like to ask all of the panelists to touch maybe on the Chinese string of pearls.
Chinese what?
String of pearls.
Okay.
So the ports of Piraeus and Gwadar and so forth. Also, what the positions of the nations in regard to the actual line of control in India would be. So very much in regard to India, with regard to India.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Third question. Yes, please.
Just sort of following up on the first question, I was just wondering, especially since Mr. or Dr. Wagner and Professor GERSTL, you talked about the ASEAN partnership with Germany, and you talked about the sort of lack of unity among ASEAN members. I was just wondering, sort of, just what does it look like practically for a country to engage with ASEAN? Who do you talk to? How do you engage with ASEAN? Yeah, that's just my question. Thank you.
Okay. Is there a fourth one? Yes, please.
What was the reaction of ASEAN countries towards the invasion of Russia in the Ukraine? Because we heard something about the reaction of African countries, but how did the ASEAN countries react?
Thank you. Last one in this round. Yes, please, over here.
It's not rather question, but rather comment on the last presentation of the Professor GERSTL. You have presented two scenarios on the future of Indo-Pacific region. The first one, of course, seems to everybody preferable than the second scenario that you unfortunately would describe more likely to happen. But I would just argue that, you know, whether or not the second scenario will be prevented depends on how much the European colleagues can continue its interest and also the influence towards the region. Coming from the region, from Japan, I would like to argue that the first scenario would be still possible as long as countries like Europeans can keep the momentum and the presence in the region. Of course, Putin's war in Ukraine is something that we are worried, and you have to be occupied for the time being. But we have expressed our, of course, solidarity to Ukraine, even from the region like this. So I think beyond the regional concern, I think everybody should be paying attention to on your side, towards this region. That will be very, very, I think, it's preferable and also desirable for members like us. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe we go into the first round of answers, and because Christian Wagner and Alfred GERSTL were confronted directly. Maybe they start out, and then may I ask also Stefania and Antoine to complete. Maybe, yeah, Christian, if you start.
Yes, okay, thank you. I heard two questions. I've not really got the questions on the string of pearls, but I got the question on the LAC. So the line of actual control between India and Pakistan, between India and China. This is a serious concern for our Indian friends. We have seen since the confrontation in 2020. This was a major blow, let's say, in India-China relations, because it was a blow to nearly 30 years of rapprochement between the two major Asian powers, and both have signed several agreements to keep up peace and tranquility in the border region. So the LAC is probably at the moment the most difficult area of concern for India. What is also concerning our Indian friends is that when you discuss it with Indians, India-China is still a bilateral problem. So India does not frame this conflict in a larger geostrategic environment, but the Chinese are doing it. So this is also, let's say, a change in the perception that from the Chinese side, there was a clear link to bring the LAC not in the traditional approach of being a bilateral border problem, but also see the problems at the LAC as part of a larger confrontation between India and China, and India being in the US camp. This is extremely difficult because our Indian friends normally do not want to be seen to be in anyone's camp, which also then created problems in the Quad when there was the debate on Russia in Quad, or on the Ukraine, where it was India which was reluctant to criticize Russia. But that's part of a larger debate. I just make these two or three points. On the German cooperation with ASEAN, Germans are heavily supportive of regional organizations, and we are supporting, for instance, the ASEAN Secretariat. Of course, we know that ASEAN is a very different form of cooperation compared to the EU, but also a very successful one. We may also support academic platforms and different fora in the ASEAN context. I'm not working on Southeast Asia. Alfred will give you a better background. Last point, even if ASEAN may not be, as Alfred said, it's often labeled as a paper tiger, a talk shop, and all these things. You should still see it in comparison to other regional organizations. And there, ASEAN is relatively successful. For instance, Germany and Europe tried to support the South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation in the 1990s. They gave it up in the 2000s because nothing really worked. So even if you may face problems with ASEAN, keep in mind other regional organizations, unfortunately, have even not a very good track record. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Alfred, if you continue.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks, Christian. I think we can generalize your statement on Germany's relation with ASEAN to EU's relations with ASEAN. I think that was a very good point. Let me switch to the question on the reaction of ASEAN and the Southeast Asian members to Putin's invasion. 3 years ago, Werner and we have been invited to a workshop in Vietnam, and it was called Small Powers in International Politics, Austria and Vietnam. Austria, 9 million inhabitants, Vietnam, more than 90. So we really asked them, are you serious? And yes, but if you compare 100 million inhabitants with 1.4 in China, then you're a small power. And that's also the lens how, in the Indo-Pacific, not only in Southeast Asia, Putin's invasion of Ukraine is viewed. A big power, a nuclear power, and a member of the UN Security Council. So think of other countries which have the same criteria, invades a small country. So that's the immediate reaction. I think it will take some more weeks until all governments really understand the strategic relevance for them, what has happened in Europe, because Europe is far away, and Ukraine is not a major partner in the Indo-Pacific. However, ASEAN, in its statement, it did not mention Russia by name, so no naming and shaming, again, and all involved parties should find a solution. That's very cynical. So it might be a different statement in a couple of weeks. I do hope so. What's a country that stands out is Singapore. Singapore clearly condemned the invasion, spoke clearly, mentioned Russia, and also joined all sanctions against Russia. Strong statements also from Indonesia, from the Philippines, and I was surprised, Cambodia, which is very close to China and is the current ASEAN chair. And it's an authoritarian regime. So it was also critical. So that came as a surprise. So I think the ASEAN position, the position of the 10 countries, it's evolving because, of course, the United States will apply a lot of pressure, I guess also the EU, that ASEAN speaks out. But let me just mention European Union's relations with ASEAN. What is expected? Yes, apart from technical support for ASEAN as regional organization, I would say ASEAN is open to learn from the European experience in economic cooperation, and it would expect more security defense cooperation. But now I'm happy to give the word to you, Antoine.
Maybe we ask before that, Stefania, especially the EU ASEAN relation, if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, thanks. EU ASEAN, the two focal points on the strategy were indeed India and ASEAN. So I would expect some investment in there. Actually, I wanted to pick up two other points as well on the line of actual control and on the reaction of the EU, like the danger of looking away from the region or what. So on the line of actual control, I share, of course, very much what Christian said before, but I would like to flip a little bit the picture as well, in the sense that some actually say this as an opportunity for China to test a little bit how far they can go and see how far they can push the situation until the international community, notably the West, actually takes the side of India. So it's a little bit a way of testing how far China can expand itself, and on the other side, how strong is the relation with India. So it's very much a testing, I think. It's a very much of a testing ground where China especially tests not only the capacity of India, which in fact it knows that is, India most unlikely will undertake a serious confrontation with China, because of course it knows that the day when it enters a confrontation with China, apart from the clear disadvantage military that India has compared to China, but it immediately will shift into a two-front confrontation, China and Pakistan. So it's quite unlikely that India will raise the bar on this and have this kind of confrontation. But I think from the Chinese side is a little bit more of a test to see if and in which form the Western intervention could intervene into this scenario, if at all, again. And then the point on the danger of looking away, that is a little bit what happened in the 2014 scenario, indeed, kind of like similar scenario with Russia challenging Ukraine and the attention shifting away from China, and China taking the opportunity to gearing up and doing the homework that they were allowed to do without the international attention in the region. I do not think it is the same scenario today. I think today we are in a different context. Everybody is much more aware of what is happening in the Indo-Pacific. Everybody knows that, is actually expecting rather, China, as I said before, China to use this situation as a sort of a learning experience on what could happen in case of a similar situation with Taiwan. So I think the attention is very high, and you see that also, of course, from the link that is done also in the international media. So the issue is absolutely under the watch of the international attention.
Yeah, thank you very much. And if you continue, Antoine?
Sure. Very briefly on many different points. On Taiwan, I fully agree it's completely different for at least two very main reasons. The first one is that you have US security guarantees towards Taiwan that you don't have towards Ukraine. That's a big difference. And the second one is that the PLA, the People Liberation Army, so far lack a lot of military capacity, including amphibious capacity, to be credible if it decides at the end of the day to invade Taiwan, plus something we got from the war in Ukraine, that you need a lot of precision strike capabilities. China has been building up its capacity over the last 20 years only, unlike Russia that has been building them for much longer period, yet Russia is lacking today this kind of precision strike capacities. So one of the big thing that China can learn is that it needs even more precision strike capacity that it has today, plus the amphibious, etc. India, very briefly, that's what we can see through satellite imageries when we analyze the position of both the Indian and the Chinese troops at the border, is the key hardening of the positions on both sides. They are really like hardening in terms of artillery, in terms of just like, you know, like the living areas for the soldiers, etc. So they intend to stay and to harden the borders. So it means as well that you have potential of more interaction and more incidents on both sides of the line of control. To get back now on the question on Southeast Asia, on the string of pearls first, I would say that it's a 20 years old concept that have never existed. Because in the academia, we don't use that concept, and in the military, they don't use it neither. That the idea that China is going to build some military bases as well as civilian bases, civilian ports, all around the Indian Ocean, mostly, but from basically the Chinese shores to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, etc., it never materialized. So China has only one military base these days. It's in Djibouti. Yes, it's a huge base, much bigger than just a support base, as they claim it to be. There is a key question, but it has been ongoing for more than 5 years, is whether China is going to build some additional military facilities. We have a huge concern about Cambodia right now, because there are some huge construction in one very specific site that we are monitoring. But for China, it has a huge cost. To build a military base in Djibouti is easy. We all have a base in Djibouti. So we cannot say anything if China builds a base in Djibouti. If China starts to build base in Pakistan, you know, that's what the Gwadar port, and China has been supposed to, I mean, if you read the press, it has been like 15 years that China is supposed to have built a base in Pakistan. It's not the case. Cambodia is a bit more new, and we have some concern once again, but for China, it has huge cost, because you know the idea that, oh, China is different than the other country because they don't have military base, that argument falls. And then you're going to raise a lot of concern, including South Asia, about China's militarization. And finally, in terms of the added value of a military base in Cambodia, honestly, it's useless. I mean, they have artificialized and militarized islands in the South China Sea. The added value of a big military base, navy base in Cambodia is very limited. It's much more interesting to have one in Guinea, in the Atlantic Ocean, to have one maybe in the, like Bangladesh, etc. There is no plan for them to have one in Bangladesh, but in terms of geography, makes more sense. I mean, Cambodia is not, the added value is limited. Very briefly on ASEAN, honestly, at the European level, we have a huge problem with that. When we talk about Indo-Pacific, everyone is focusing on Southeast Asia and on the ASEAN. Everyone. You go to any capital in Europe these days, Indo-Pacific, oh, ASEAN. It's a key partner. You know, it looks a little bit like the EU, so it's a key partner. As was explained before, it's complicated with ASEAN. It's one thing to imagine that the ASEAN is just like the EU and that it's easy to have the cooperation. It's complicated. Plus, you have huge differences, and to be very honest, in terms of business, we care much more about Vietnam than about Cambodia, or even Indonesia, even though Indonesia has a huge potential, and the French identify Indonesia as a potential strategic partner, even though it will be very different than the partnership we have with India and Japan. So with ASEAN, it's complicated. But in terms of security, there is one area in which we can do more. It's not military cooperation, because once again, we have very limited capacities, but it's about the Coast Guard, it's about police, it's about, you know, all about like internal and domestic security, in which the Europeans can provide and have some partnerships. And just to conclude, on the key question that was raised is how do we maintain the momentum while there is a war in Ukraine? Because to be very clear on that, today, if I take the French example, in the Élysée, in the Quai d'Orsay, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, no one is talking about the Indo-Pacific anymore. No one. Because all of our resources are being drained and exhausted on Ukraine. It does not mean that we are losing people working on the Indo-Pacific. We still have the people working on China, on Japan, on India, etc. But the problem we have is in terms of political agenda. It's very difficult to put the Indo-Pacific at the top of the political agenda these days. You're the French president. If you have 30 minutes in the day to talk about international politics, you're going to spend like 2 hours on Ukraine. So it's very hard to make, you know, big move on the Indo-Pacific these days. So let's see in a few months. But the key question we have is it's very hard in the short term to amplify the dynamic as was expected in 2022. It's almost impossible, let's be honest. But how do we maintain the momentum at least? And as such, the Czech presidency and then the Swedish presidency of the Council of the EU will be very important. And we need to make sure that in Prague, that in Stockholm, Prague, I mean, it's clear, Stockholm, it's quite clear as well, that we keep talking about the Indo-Pacific. And maybe we need to wait a little bit so that it can get back at the top of the agenda, but we need to make sure not to lose kind of the flame of the Indo-Pacific. I think this is the best we can expect, but to expect realistically that we can broaden the cooperation, increase the moment, increase the dynamic in the coming weeks, it's impossible because of Ukraine, just impossible. So we need to keep the interest, we need to keep the momentum, but to amplify the dynamic in the short term, just impossible.
Okay, thank you. 3 more questions, and then the end. Okay, 1. You know, I'm breaking an iron rule. Usually we do not go beyond 2 hours, but because we have such prominent experts and the theme is so interesting. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. And I have a question primarily to Mr. Wagner, I suppose. So in case China will supply and support Russia in this crisis, would it impact the Germany's perception and attitude towards the Chinese Belt and Road project? And is it likely that Berlin would force and ask other EU member states to postpone such cooperation with China in terms of Belt and Road? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? No?
Oh,
yeah, okay. Okay, please in the last row.
All right. First of all, thank you all for a really great presentation. So I'll try and formulate a question, but my brain's a little overloaded. Quick question about, I guess it goes back to France's presence in the Indo-Pacific. It's about the France's presence there, I guess, is a cornerstone of it is the territorial presence there, the islands, I guess, is what I'm getting at. What's the real strategic, I guess, geopolitical or socioeconomic, how much, I guess what I'm trying to ask is how much weight does it really carry to have these islands there, these territorial possessions, and how are they viewed in the area? Thanks.
Thank you. Very last question. No, I don't see a hand so far. Please, our speakers, may I ask you for answering the question and also using your last words. And I start with the lady. Stefania, if you are so nice.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think this round there was a little questions for me. So I simply leave you with the last word of indeed the I share that we are now in a situation where all the attention and the resources are shifted into the eastern neighborhood of the EU, obviously. And where I'm afraid we're just at the beginning of the evolution of a situation. I think for me, critically will be, again, the impact, if at all, but I think it will have an impact of this abstention of India from voting and taking side. And we also heard about the reluctance in condemning Russia during the Quad meeting. So all of this at some point will have an impact in the EU-India relation. It's way too early to know. But again, there was a lot of expectation that was built up with all of this political hiatus, that political weight that was put in the last 18 months. So now I'm afraid that we're going towards, again, a little bit of a slowing of relation. And this might be a little bit of a problem for the region, because the relation between EU and India were a driver force of EU's engagement in the region. Yes, the centrality of ASEAN, we have heard about it, but the efficiency of EU-India relation, you know, as Christian said, you always have to compare the situation with what is the alternative. The EU-India relation may not be 100% full steam ahead, but maybe EU-ASEAN relation are still need to develop. At the end of the day, our strategic partners only for a year and something, so they still have to develop. So let's see what will happen in the next month with the evolution of this important partnership. And thanks again for having me today. It was an excellent discussion.
Thank you so much for answering the questions, and especially also for your speech, for your statement. It really was highly, highly interesting and valuable. May I ask now Christian for his words?
Yes, thank you very much. Concerning the question, I think we have seen in Europe the shift towards China, because EU documents, and this is more or less consensus among EU countries, most EU countries, that China is not only a partner, but also a competitor or a systemic rival. Now, on Ukraine, I think China is also one of the few countries where we all hope that they will have some influence over Russia. So I think we will not see, let's say, a hardening of Germany or the EU towards China, but we may use China as an interlocutor or a mediator in this kind of conflict, as China is also a P5 member. So in that sense, I do not really see that we will push pressure on China with regard to the BRI projects. It would be a different, let's say, setting if we would discuss, let's say, a Chinese attack on Taiwan, as we have done. Then of course it would be a different setup. But at this point of time, I think we may also look for closer cooperation with China, also to find a solution to this crisis. On the EU-India, I think I would follow Stefania's argumentation. My fear is that this Ukraine crisis can also become a major problem for our Indian friends. For the simple reason, so far the Indians have quite successfully tried to balance between the Soviet Union, Russia, and the US. Now, if this balancing now is no longer possible, because when the Russians are closer to China, that's a nightmare for the Indians. When the Indians are following Russia, they can enter the US sanctions regime, which is even a bigger nightmare probably. So it's also not a good choice. And if they just continue as before, as Stefania has mentioned, you may end up in the situation that we're starting a debate in Western capitals in how far is India really the kind of democracy / reliable partner that we all assume that the Indians are? Maybe not. So that's also a problem, and I think the Indians will hope and pray that this crisis is going to go over rather quickly, because all the options which are there are not very good for India and may also have some negative impact on EU-India and relations with India, also to the US. So thank you very much again for having me. It was an excellent debate. Thanks to my panelists for the wonderful presentations, and look forward to further interaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian.
Yeah, very briefly, the first question on the French territories in the Indo-Pacific. I think there is no debate in the region that we are resident power in the Indo-Pacific, even though, of course, our capacities are very limited, because most of our capacities are in mainland France and not in New Caledonia, Polynesia, and Reunion Island. And there is a need on the French side to really make sure that these territories can benefit to the fullest to the Indo-Pacific region. And that's not something that we've really taken into account so far. That's partly a sociological problem. The people designing the strategy are either diplomats or army people, military people, etc. They are not the people that have lived except the military. They are not the people that are have a specific experience. They are not the people who work in the Ministry in Interior that is also in charge of these overseas territories. So we need also, within the French government, to make sure that the people working in the overseas territories and that the overseas population are even more included than before in the French strategy for the Indo-Pacific, and that these territories can also benefit from the growing interests that Europeans have in the region. And for example, the AFD, Agence Française de Développement, can fund projects, even with European money, that cover French territory in the region as well as foreign countries. And that's something also that these territories are looking forward. Very briefly, because we discussed concrete cooperation, and Stefania mentioned the PESCO project, mentioning that 3 non-EU countries were part of PESCO. We, of course, could think of expanding it to Japan. And there is basically one project that could be very interesting with Japan, is everything related to seabed strategy or underwater surveillance. The Japanese have huge capacities in terms of underwater ISR. That's something that the Europeans are trying to improve. So that's one very specific case. And just last but not least on Ukraine, from a French perspective, because we had today a call between Macron, Scholz, and Xi. It's a format, the 2+1, like France, Germany plus China, that is interesting. But I think we need to be very careful as French and German on that format, because it's being criticized in many European countries. In 2019, we made sure when Xi Jinping visited Paris on a state visit to invite back then Chancellor Merkel, President Juncker, and it was a France, Germany, EU Commission plus China summit. It was very interesting because we had this kind of European dimension. We didn't have it today. We didn't have it on the last few occasions in 2021 when we had this kind of format, 2+1. We need to make sure to integrate the Europeans to the fullest, to make sure to, if we have this 2+1, explain to the Europeans before this summit what our intentions are and to debrief them afterwards. We need maybe to change the 2+1 and at least have kind of a Weimar format plus China, so to include Poland as well. And with what's going on in Ukraine, to have Poland on board in this kind of 3+1 would of course make sense, and to make sure that on the Chinese side, the humanitarian issue that we have right now with Ukraine is being addressed and is being heard in Beijing. And of course, thank you very much for the invitation. It was a very interesting and challenging discussion.
Thank you so much, Antoine. Yeah. And as Home Officer, it is your duty.
Thank you, Werner. Yes, to conclude, I would like to summarize what my three other colleagues said, and of course Werner. We do witness a power shift from the West to the Indo-Pacific region. I think that is obvious. We have seen the data, and it's very impressive. And this trend will become stronger in the next years. Let me try to conclude on an optimistic note. Many authoritarian regimes in the Indo-Pacific, and of course China in the last couple of years, we also noticed as scholars. So Chinese diplomats or colleagues quite often made fun of the rules-based Western order or of our values-based foreign policy. If you look at the Ukraine right now, people are fighting for their freedom, for their liberty, for their life, and the support, the sympathy that you see in all European countries, in like-minded countries, it's really fantastic. So I think that's a message for the authoritarian regimes. They see we are prepared to defend our values, to stand up for it, and it also shows that under pressure, yes, multilateralism, European cooperation, solidarity in the West, it does work, and let's hope, and actually I'm optimistic at the end, we will succeed. So thank you very much today for your attention.
So thank you very much. I do not want to add also any consideration from my side, because I think you really had the best experts you can imagine, people who have been occupying themselves for quite some years, and this is necessary. And this is certainly a contribution for our common future. We have to be aware that the future dynamics are lying in the Indo-Pacific space. And every strategy has three elements, I used to say, you know. This is power, space, and time. Only what I want to tell you, the space is clear. The power certainly needs soft and hard power. And the time that is left is very little, because it will not wait for one actor. Time is there, and everybody who is grasping the time will be the one who will move the situation. And insofar, I really want to thank our speakers, our presenters. Thank you so much. It really was a pleasure also to have the opportunity to combine Paris and Brussels and Berlin and Vienna. It was great. Thank you so much. And I hope also it was great that Antoine managed to come. I'm looking forward, Stefania, to meet you in Vienna, and the same to you, Christian. Hopefully, I'm sure you know the issue of the Indo-Pacific will occupy us also in the future, and so far you have more or less already a card, a ticket to come to Vienna for the next time. Thank you so much, and I also want to thank our audience and everybody who has contributed to the organization. Thank you very much, and all the best. Now it's time, you know, just for a glass of wine, and I think you should use this opportunity to stand together and to have a glass of wine together. Thank you, and all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.